her own guardian, wagered her at the card table the way another man might wager a horse. And the cold stranger who won her never once looked up to ask her name. It was a little before midnight at Marsh Hollow, the Greaves' country house, in the second week of a hard, wet November. And Rosalind Thorne was standing where she had stood for 3 hours already, just behind and a little to the left of Sir Lucius Brand's chair, holding his second glass and his snuff-box and his losses, when she heard him say the words that would unmake the whole shape of her life. He did not lower his voice to say them. That was the part she would remember, after everything else had worn smooth. He said them in the same loose, charming, carrying tone he used for a good story, and he laid a small folded scrap of paper down on the green baize at the center of the table, between the guttering wax candles and the scattered coin, and he said that he had nothing more about him worth the staking, but he had this, and he tapped the paper twice with one thick finger, and what he had written upon it was her. She did not move. She had long ago learned not to move at the moments when moving would only make a thing worse, and so she stood with the snuff-box cool in her gloved hand, and her face arranged into the smooth, attentive, useful nothing that she had worn for so many years that it had stopped being a mask and become very nearly a face. But she felt the room change around her. She felt the small ripple of it run down the table, from the man across from her stepfather, who went very still, to the two ladies by the fire, who had been pretending not to watch the play, and now did not bother to pretend, to the footman by the door, whose eyes flicked once to her, and then away, ashamed for her, in a way that her own guardian was not. A scrap of paper with her name on it slid out into the light among the money, as though she were one more thing a gentleman might carry in his pockets and lose. To understand how a gentlewoman of 22 came to be standing behind a chair at midnight as a thing to be wagered, you have to understand what Rosalind Thorne had been told she was, and had believed for the better part of 11 years. She had been told she was nobody's, and that she should be grateful that anybody at all had taken her in. Her father, Mr. Edmund Thorne, had died when she was 11, of a fever caught nursing a tenant through the same, and her mother had followed him within 3 years, worn thin by widowhood, and by the marriage she had made in her widowhood, and between the one death and the other, a man had come into the house and become its master, and that man was Sir Lucius Brand. He had married the widow Thorne, people said, for her comfortable jointure and the handsome house at Thornfield, and the management of the dead man's affairs, and if there had been any warmth in it, it had not outlasted the wedding breakfast by long. To Rosalind, he had been, at the best of times, a careless and expansive stranger who patted her head when he remembered she was there, and at the worst of times a creditor to whom she somehow owed her every meal. After her mother died, he had told her, more than once with a kind of wounded generosity, that she had not a penny in the world that was her own, that her poor father had left things in a sad tangle, that the house and the money had all gone where such things go, and that he kept her on out of a duty to her mother's memory, which he hoped she would one day learn to repay with proper gratitude and proper usefulness. And so she had made herself useful. She had kept his accounts, which were a chaos. She had written his letters. She had soothed the tradesman he would not pay. She had learned to read a room before he ruined it, and to stand behind his chair, and to hold his glass. The only thing in the house that was truly her own was her mother's little mother-of-pearl card case, the silver vine on its lid worn pale with handling, and its small clasp had been broken so long that it would no longer stay shut, so that she had given up trying to close a thing that would only ever fall open in her hand. It was a small flat case meant for a lady's visiting cards, mother-of-pearl over a thin frame of silver, light as a leaf, and it had been her mother's before it, and it was worth so little that no one in 11 years had ever once thought it worth taking from her. Her mother had pressed it into her hands in the last week of her life and told her to keep it always and never to force it open further than it wished to go, that the cards do not lie, only the hands that hold them. and to wait and to trust that it would give up what it kept when there was at last something it needed to say. Rosalind had been 17 then, and grieving, and she had taken the words for the wandering of a fever, the kind of soft, sad riddle that the dying leave behind because they cannot leave anything else. She kept the case because it had been her mother's hands that held it last. She did not expect it to say anything. It sat broken on the sill of her plain little room and caught the morning. And she rested her thumb on it sometimes, on the worn pearl as if on a hand, and that was all. She had not wanted to come to Marsh Hollow. Sir Lucius had insisted, the way he insisted on all the things that were about to cost him money, with great cheer and great confidence, and a refusal to hear the word no, because the Greaves kept a deep table and an open cellar and there would be play. And play, to Sir Lucius Brand, was always the thing that was about to set everything right. He had been losing for years. Rosalind, who kept the books he thought she did not understand, knew exactly how long and how badly, though she did not know yet the true and terrible reason for it. She knew only that the house at Thornfield had been let to strangers, that the good carriage had gone, that the silver went to the silversmith a piece at a time and came back paste, and that her stepfather met every fresh disaster with the same bright certainty that the next hand, the next horse, the next clever scheme would mend it all. He had brought her to Marsh Hollow as he always brought her, to manage him, to keep him from the third bottle and the fourth, to be the quiet, sober presence at his elbow that let the company go on thinking him a charming, careless gentleman rather than a drowning man. She had not known that this time he had already gone all the way under, and that when a drowning man has nothing left to clutch, he will clutch whatever is nearest, even if it is a person, even if it is the daughter of the wife he buried. If you have ever stood at the edge of a bright, crowded room and felt yourself become invisible, counted and not seen, a useful pair of hands and a steady face, and nothing that anyone in the room imagined had a price or a future of its own, then you already know the precise cold that settled over Rosalind Thorne as that scrap of paper came to rest in the candlelight. And if you have ever wanted, just once, to see such a person's worth made plain before the very people who could not be troubled to learn her name, then stay with me, and stay with Rosalind, because the man who is about to win her at that table is not at all the man the county believes him to be. And what he does in the next hour, and in the long winter that follows it, will set in motion the undoing of every lie she has been made to live inside. The hand was not yet dealt. The cold stranger across the table had not yet looked up, and the broken little case on the windowsill at home, the one thing of her mother's that no one had ever thought worth taking, was about to begin, very slowly, to keep its promise. The man across the table from Sir Lucius Brand was the new Marquess of Dunmore, and Rosalind knew of him only what everyone in 3 counties knew of him, which was very little, and most of it unkind. He had come into the title late and sideways, by the deaths of a father and an elder brother within a single bad year, and he had spent the better part of his life before that as a younger son with no expectations to speak of, somewhere abroad, in the army or out of it. No one was quite sure. He was said to be cold. He was said to be proud. He was said to have refused half the invitations in the county since he came to live at Dunmore Park, to keep no open table, to dance with no one, to look at the world down the length of his straight nose as though it bored and faintly offended him. The matchmaking mothers had begun by being very interested in a single, well-titled, well-landed man of 37, and it ended by being very offended, which is the way of matchmaking mothers. And so the word had gone round that the Marquess of Dunmore was heartless, and that there was something wrong with him, some wound or some sin in his past that no one could name, but everyone was sure of. Rosalind had seen him perhaps 3 times across other people's rooms. He was a tall, dark, well-made man, with a hard, handsome face, and dark gray eyes that gave nothing away, and he had never once, in any of those rooms, given the smallest sign that he had noticed the quiet young woman behind Sir Lucius Brand's chair. Why should he? No one did. He had not been playing deep that night. That was the strange thing, the thing she only understood much later. He had come to Marsh Hollow, it seemed, for reasons of his own that had nothing to do with the cards, and he had sat down at the table almost reluctantly, and he had played the careful, closed, unhurried game of a man who neither needs to win nor fears to lose, which is the most dangerous game of all, to sit across from when you are desperate. Sir Lucius was desperate. Rosalind had watched the desperation come up in him over the last hour, like water rising in a cellar, the laugh going higher, the hand less steady on the glass she kept refilling against her own better judgment, because refusing him in company was a battle she could not win. He had lost his ready money, and then his notes of hand, and then a thing she had not known he still had to lose, some last small property, signed away on a torn half-sheet. And now he had nothing, and rather than rise from the table a beaten man, which was the one thing in the world Sir Lucius Brand could not bear to do, he had reached behind him, almost, into the only corner of his life that still held something another man might want, and he had brought out her. It might have ended there. A drunken man's bad joke that the table would have laughed off and the night would have swallowed, if it had not been for the man who sat at Sir Lucius's right hand. His name was Mr. Vinter, and he was a heavy, smiling, soft-spoken man, whom nobody quite knew, who had appeared in the neighborhood that autumn with a great deal of money and no visible source for it, and who had been quietly bleeding Sir Lucius all evening, with the patience of a man who enjoys the bleeding more than the money. Rosalind had disliked and feared him on sight, without being able to say why. She understood it later. When the scrap of paper came down on the baize, Mr. Vinter did not laugh. He leaned forward, and his smile widened, and he said, in his soft, pleasant voice, that he would be very glad to cover Sir Lucius's stake, and that he had always thought the young person behind the chair a most superior sort of young person, and that he would undertake to provide her a comfortable situation in his own household. Very comfortable indeed, and he let the words sit in the air, with a meaning in them that turned Rosalind's blood to cold water. She knew then, with a clarity that arrived all at once and left her perfectly steady, exactly what kind of comfortable situation Mr. Vinter meant, and she understood that her stepfather, who was looking at the man's money and not at his face, was about to lose her to him and call it luck. It was at that moment that the Marquess of Dunmore looked up. He had not, until then, appeared to be attending to any of it. He had been sitting back a little from the table with his cards held loosely and his dark face still, and Rosalind had half thought he found the whole scene beneath his notice. But now he set his cards down, face down, with a small deliberate motion, and he looked at Mr. Vinter for a long moment with an expression that did not change and was somehow the more frightening for not changing, and then he said, in a low even voice that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room, that he believed the stake was Sir Lucius's to set and the present hand was his own to win, and that he would thank Mr. Vinter to keep his comfortable situations to himself. And then he turned his head, and for the first time in the whole of that long night, for the first time in the 3 or 4 times their paths had crossed in their 2 lives, the Marquess of Dunmore looked directly at Rosalind Thorne. It was not a kind look. She would not have known what to do with a kind look just then. It would have undone her, and she had no intention of being undone in front of that room. It was a cool, level, searching look. A look that took in her steadiness and her stillness and the snuff box held just so in her gloved hand, and seemed to weigh something behind her face, and find it not at all what he had expected. It lasted perhaps the length of 2 breaths. Then he turned back to the table, and he picked up his cards, and he said, quietly, "Deal." She did not remember the hand itself. She remembered the cards going down one by one in the wax light, and her stepfather's breathing, and Mr. Vinter's soft, furious smile, and the cold press of the snuff-box edge into her palm where she had gripped it too hard. And she remembered the end of it, the Marquess laying down his cards without any show at all, the way a man closes a book he has finished, and the small, terrible sound of Sir Lucius Brand letting out his breath, and someone at the fire saying "oh" in a hushed voice, and the understanding going round the room like cold air under a door that the young woman behind the chair had just been won, fairly and squarely and in front of everyone, by the cold Marquess of Dunmore, who had not so much as raised his voice to do it. Sir Lucius recovered first, because Sir Lucius always recovered first. It was the secret of his ruin. He laughed, a little too loud, and he said something gallant and dreadful about my lord having the devil's own luck and a man's debts being a man's debts. And he half rose and made as if to present her, actually to present her, his own dead wife's daughter, across the wreckage of his money, as though she were a parcel to be handed over with the compliments of the house. And Rosalind, who had stood through 3 hours and 11 years of being a thing in other people's hands, felt something in her go very quiet, and very cold, and very far away, and she thought, with a strange detachment of the little broken case upstairs at home on the windowsill, the one thing of her mother's that no one had ever thought worth taking from her, and she understood that even she, even her mother's daughter, had been counted among the stakes. When her stepfather wrote her name on the scrap of paper and slid it across the baize, that was the moment the last childish corner of her, the corner that had gone on hoping he might one day be something to her, quietly and finally died. But the Marquess did not take the parcel. He rose, and he was very tall, and he did not look at Sir Lucius at all. He looked at Rosalind, and he asked her, in that same low even voice, stripped now of the edge he had used on Mr. Vinter, whether she had a maid and a box in the house. It was such an ordinary question, so entirely unlike anything the moment seemed to call for, that it steadied her better than any gentleness could have done. She said that she had a small box and no maid. He nodded, once, as though that settled a thing he had been deciding, and he said that the hour was late and the roads were bad, and that she would oblige him by being ready to leave within the half-hour, and that the housekeeper at Dunmore Park was a respectable woman who would see her properly settled, and that she need have no fear of any comfortable situation under his roof. And then he said the thing that she turned over in her mind for a great many nights afterward, lying awake in a strange house. He said it almost under his breath, not quite to her and not quite to himself, looking for a moment at the scrap of paper still lying in the spilled candle grease among the coin. He said, "A person is not a stake." And then he gathered his winnings, which did not include her, because he left her name where it lay on the table, and he walked out of the room to call for his carriage, and left her to go up and pack her box. If you've made it this far into Rosalind's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She packed it herself, by a single candle in the small cold room the Greaves had given the daughter of a guest who did not signify. There was very little to pack. 2 plain gowns, her mother's gray shawl, a worn prayer book, a comb, and, last, wrapped in a square of flannel and set down at the very top where her hand could find it, the little mother-of-pearl card case with the broken clasp, falling open in her palm as it always did, and inside it nothing but a sprig of dried rosemary gone to dust at the edges and her mother's garnet ring on its faded ribbon. She held the case for a moment in the candlelight and thought of her mother's voice saying the cards do not lie, only the hands that hold them, and she thought how strange it was that the words should come back to her now, tonight, of all the nights when the cards had just lied so thoroughly about who and what she was. She closed her hand over it, the way you cannot close the case itself, and she put on her bonnet, and she went down to be taken away by a man she did not know to a house she had never seen. The legal winnings of a hand of cards she had been forbidden, by every rule of her sex and her station, to so much as touch. The drive to Dunmore Park was 11 miles, and it took the better part of 2 hours over those bad roads, in the dark, in a fine well-sprung carriage that smelled of leather and cold and a faint clean trace of the man who owned it. He did not ride inside with her. That too she noticed and turned over later. He had handed her into the carriage with a correctness that was almost severe, and then he had mounted his own horse and ridden alongside in the wet dark, so that she traveled the whole way alone with her box and her thoughts and the rocking of the wheels, perfectly safe and perfectly bewildered, the one woman who had not after all been claimed. She watched the black hedges go by in the carriage lamp and tried to feel afraid and could not quite manage it, and that frightened her more than fear would have done, because it meant that some part of her, against all sense, had decided to trust the cold stranger on the horse outside, on the strength of 4 words spoken over a card table. A person is not a stake. She did not know yet what those 4 words had cost the man who spoke them, or how long ago, or how much. She knew only that no one in 11 years had said anything to her that had landed quite like that. Dunmore Park, when at last the carriage swung in between its tall stone gateposts and up a long dark avenue of dripping trees, was a great gray pile of a house, far older and far less comfortable looking than Marsh Hollow, with only a few windows lit in all its long front. There was no welcome got up for her, no line of curious servants, no warmth and bustle. There was a single lantern at the door and a thin, upright, gray-haired woman in a dark dress and a white cap who came out into the wet to meet the carriage, and who took one look at the white, exhausted, oddly composed young woman being handed down from it, and one look at her master's shuttered face, and asked no questions at all. This was Mrs. Down, the housekeeper, and she had served the family at Dunmore in the old days, before the bad year and the deaths, and she had a way of knowing things without being told that Rosalind came to be very grateful for. The Marquess said only that Miss Thorne had come to the house under unfortunate circumstances that were no fault of her own, that she was to be treated as a lady and a guest and on no account as anything less, and that Mrs. Down was to give her the south room and whatever she required. And then he bowed to Rosalind, a small, stiff, correct bow, and bade her good night, and went away into the dark house. And that was the whole of the first night, and the beginning of everything. She woke the next morning in the south room of Dunmore Park, not knowing, for one long blank moment, where in the world she was. The room was large and old and very plain, with faded hangings and a wide cold hearth and a window that looked east over a tangle of bare gardens to a line of hills. And the morning light came in gray and clean and lay across the foot of the bed. And Rosalind lay still and let the events of the night before assemble themselves slowly into a thing that had actually happened. She had been wagered at a card table. She had been won. She was, by whatever monstrous fiction the law and the company at Marsh Hollow had agreed to honor, in some sense the property or the charge or the obligation of a man she had spoken perhaps 40 words to in her life. And he had ridden 11 miles in the wet rather than sit in a carriage with her, and had left her name on the table among the coin, and had said that a person is not a stake. She did not know what to make of any of it. So she did the thing she always did when she did not know what to make of a thing. She got up, and she washed in the cold water, and she dressed herself neatly in her plain slate blue gown, and she set about, very quietly, learning the shape of the place she had landed in. The first thing she did, before she went down, was to take the little card case out of the flannel and set it on the sill of the east window where the morning would reach it, beside her mother's garnet ring on its ribbon, exactly as it had sat on the sill of her old room at home. It was a small foolish thing to do, and she knew it, but the case falling open in her hand and lying there broken in the clean light made the strange room a fraction less strange, made it somewhere her mother's daughter might belong, and she rested her thumb for a moment on the worn pearl as if on a hand, and listened to the quiet where an answer should have been, and then she went down to meet whatever the day held. What the day held, and the day after it, and all the slow gray days of that first fortnight, was a kind of suspended strangeness that Rosalind had no name for. She was treated, exactly as the Marquess had ordered, as a lady and a guest. Mrs. Down saw to it with a fierce quiet correctness that allowed no one in the household, from the footman to the kitchen maids, to treat Miss Thorne as anything other than a gentle woman to whom some misfortune had happened that was not to be spoken of. A maid was assigned to her. A place was laid for her at the great cold dining table, where she and the Marquess sat at opposite ends of an expanse of dark polished wood and exchanged perhaps a dozen words a meal, with 2 footmen standing by, and where she learned that the cold reserve the county complained of was not at least a performance. He was the same shuttered, courteous, distant man at his own table with no one watching as he had been in the crowded room at Marsh Hollow. He went out early on his horse most mornings, about the business of the estate, and came back wet and silent, and shut himself in the library, and Rosalind, who had nothing whatever to do in that great house, and had never in her life had nothing to do, began very quietly to go quietly mad. For here was the thing that no one at Dunmore Park yet understood about the young woman the Marquess had brought home, and that Rosalind herself had half forgotten under 11 years of being told she was useless and dependent. She was not, in fact, a helpless ornament who had been kept for her looks. She was a person of considerable parts who had been running a careless man's entire household and finances since she was 17. Who could keep a ledger and write a business letter and read a contract and manage a tradesman, and who could no more sit idle in a faded drawing-room embroidering a screen than she could fly. And Dunmore Park, for all its grandeur, was a house that had plainly been let go. She saw it in the first 3 days. She could not help seeing it. The accounts that lay half done on a side table because the steward had died in the autumn and not been replaced. The damp creeping up the morning room wall because a gutter wanted clearing. The good linen rotting in a press because no one had aired it since the old days. The garden, the garden. The great walled garden behind the house that had plainly once been somebody's pride and was now a wilderness of black bramble and collapsed frames, and one stubborn neglected border of gray-green herbs gone leggy and wild, where she found, pushing up through the wreck of it, a single half-strangled bush of rosemary, the very herb whose dried sprig lay in her mother's broken case upstairs, and she stood looking at it for a long time in the cold with something tightening in her throat. She began at first in the smallest and most apologetic way to put things right. She could not help it. She aired the linen. She finished the accounts, in a clear, neat hand, leaving them where the master would find them, half afraid she had overstepped some line she could not see. She had the gutter cleared by speaking quietly to one of the men. She coaxed the kitchen, threw Mrs. Downe into sending up dinners that a sick old house could be warmed by rather than chilled. And she went out, in her brown cloak in the raw afternoons, into the ruined walled garden, and she began, with her own soft hands that her station said should never do such work, to cut back the black bramble from the one living herb border, to free the rosemary, to clear a small square of the wreck and turn the cold earth, because it was the one thing in all that grand strange house that felt like hers to mend. It was Mrs. Downe who first began to look at her differently, and then to talk to her, in the careful sideways way of an old servant testing whether a confidence is safe. She found Rosalind one wet afternoon in the still-room, sleeves turned back, setting the neglected shelves to rights, and instead of scolding she stood in the doorway and watched, and at length she said, very dry, that it was a strange sort of young lady that the master had brought home, who mended a house instead of breaking it. And Rosalind, surprised into honesty, said that she had never in her life lived in a house she was not expected to mend, and the 2 women looked at each other, and something was understood between them, and after that Mrs. Downe began to tell her things. She told her, over the mending and the linen and the long still-room afternoons, the things the county did not know about the cold Marquess of Dunmore, not all at once, but over the slow gray weeks of that first winter. Piece by piece, Rosalind began to assemble out of Mrs. Downe's careful confidences a picture of her strange host that bore very little resemblance to the heartless man of the neighborhood's gossip. He had been the second son, Mrs. Downe said, the younger of 2 by some years, and the family had made no secret in the old days of which son the title and the lands and the money were meant for. The elder, the one who had been Marquess for that single bad year before the fever took him too, had been the handsome one and the charming one and the favorite, and the present master had grown up in his shadow, the steady, plain, dutiful younger boy whom nobody troubled much to love. He had gone for a soldier because there was nothing else for a younger son to do, and he had done well at it. By all accounts, in hard places far from home, and he had come back years ago with a little money of his own, a small competence, the one thing in the world that was truly and undeniably his, and his brother had taken it from him. Here Mrs. Downs' voice always dropped, and she would glance at the door, because this was the thing that was never spoken of at Dunmore. The elder brother, deep in his own debts and his own pleasures, had got the younger to a gaming table one night, among friends who were not friends, and there had been a great deal of wine, and the play had been crooked, though it was never proved and never named, and the younger son had risen from that table in the gray morning stripped of every penny of the small fortune he had earned and saved. And his brother had laughed, and the family had taken the brother's side, because the family always took the brother's side, and the matter had been smoothed over as a young man's folly and his own fault for sitting down to play. And the younger son had said nothing. He had paid what he could not afford to pay, and he had gone away again. Abroad. For years, and he had not come home until the fever had carried off first the father and then, within months, the laughing brother, and the title and the lands and the debts had fallen, sideways and unwanted, on the one son nobody had ever meant to have them. Rosalind sat with that a long time, in the still room, with the rosemary scent on her hands. She understood then a great many things at once. She understood why a man would ride 11 miles in the rain rather than sit in a carriage with a young woman he had no right to. She understood why his face shut like a door. And above all she understood, with a jolt that went through her like cold water, why the Marquess of Dunmore, of all the men at that table at Marsh Hollow, had been the one to look up when a person was set among the stakes, and to say, "Lo, that a person is not a stake." He had been a stake himself. Once, he had been the thing won and laughed over and walked away from. He knew, from the inside, in his own bones, exactly what it was to be counted as a thing among a careless man's losses, and he had not been able to sit at that table and watch it done to someone else. She did not let him see that she knew. It was not her secret to have, and she had a great horror, having been pitied so long herself, of being caught pitying anyone. But she found after that she could not look at his shuttered face across the long cold table without seeing the boy in the shadow and the young man robbed in the gray morning, and the seeing changed something in her, softened something, made her watch him not with the wariness of the one woman but with the slow-growing attention of one wounded creature recognizing another. And he, for his part, had begun, though she did not yet know it, to watch her too. The thaw, when it came slowly and through the things she had mended. He found the accounts first. She did not know it for some days. He said nothing, but she noticed that the half-done ledgers had been moved, and that a fresh quill had been left beside them, sharpened, and a stoppered ink, and the next week's tradesmen's bills laid out in a neat stack that had not been neat before, and she understood that this was the cold Marquess of Dunmore's way of asking her to go on. So she went on. She took over the running of the house as quietly as breathing, and the great cold pile of Dunmore Park began, week by week through that hard winter, to come back to a kind of life, the fires laid right, and the dinners warm, and the damp driven back, and the dust gone from the long galleries. And the master said nothing about any of it. And she said nothing. And a strange wordless partnership grew up between them out of mended gutters and balanced columns and aired linen, the way such things sometimes grow between two people who are each, in their separate ways, too proud and too wounded to say a plain warm word. He began to come to dinner earlier. That was the first thing she could point to. He began to be in the dining room when she came down, instead of arriving silent and late. And the dozen words a meal became a score, and then more. And they were careful words at first, about the estate, about the weather, about a book. But they were words, and she found that the cold Marquess, when he could be got to speak at all, had a dry, quiet wit hidden somewhere far down under all that shuttered reserve, and a mind that had read a great deal in its long, lonely years abroad, and a way of listening to what she said as though it might actually be worth the hearing, which no man in her life had ever done. She had spent 11 years being talked over and through and around. To be listened to by anyone was a strange, warm, dangerous thing, and to be listened to by him was more dangerous still, and she knew it, and could not stop. The crisis came in the worst week of January, when the river that ran through the low meadows came up in a night of black rain and threatened the cottages of half a dozen tenant families on the water meadows. And the Marquess was away, gone 2 days to the Assizes town on business, and not expected back before the flood would be at its height. The steward was dead and not replaced. There was no one to give an order. And Rosalind, who had run a household in chaos since she was 17, did not wait to be helpless. She put on her brown cloak and her stout boots, and she went down into the rain herself, and she found Jonah Crisp, the under-steward, a steady, honest man who had been only waiting for someone to tell him it was allowed, and between them, through that long black streaming day, they got the tenant families and their few beasts and their few goods up out of the water to the high barns, and got the men set to sandbagging the weak place in the bank, and got hot food carried down from the park kitchens to people who had lost their hearths, and Rosalind stood in the rain with her hair down her back and the mud to her knees and directed the saving of half a hamlet as though she had been born to it, which, though she did not yet know it, she had. The Marquess came home a day early, riding hard through the wet, having heard of the flood on the road, braced for disaster, and found his tenants safe and dry in his high barns and his bank holding and hot soup going round, and the whole desperate business already in hand. Managed. Finished. Well, and in the middle of it. Soaked and filthy and luminous with the particular fierce joy of a capable person who has been allowed at last to be capable. The young woman he had won at a card table and brought home and could not account for. He sat his horse in the rain and looked at her across the flooded yard for a long moment, and something happened in his hard-guarded face that she had never seen there before. Something that cracked it right open, and he did not say anything clever or cold or correct. He swung down off the horse and came to her through the mud and the rain, and he took both her cold, muddy hands in his, which he had never done, which no rule of their strange arrangement permitted, and he said low, that he did not know what manner of woman he had brought into his house, but that he was beginning to think the man who had let her go at a card table was the greatest fool in England. And Rosalind, standing in the rain with her hands in his, felt the whole careful structure of her composure shake on its foundations, and understood, with a kind of terror, that she had fallen in love with him, and that it could come to nothing, because she was a dependent with not a penny in the world, one at cards, and he was a marquess, and the distance between them was as wide and cold as the flood at their feet. It was after the flood that he saw the card case. He had walked up with her through the wet dusk to see her safely in, an unheard of intimacy, and at the door of the south room some question of a dry shawl had taken them both across the threshold. And his eye fell on the little pearl case lying open on her windowsill, unable to shut, beside the garnet ring on its faded ribbon, catching the last gray light. And something in his guarded face shifted, as though he too kept some small broken thing of a person who had counted him as nothing, and had never once been able to make it give its account. He crossed to it without asking, the way you go to a thing that has reached out and taken hold of you, and he stood looking down at it, and he asked her, quietly, whether it would not shut. And she said that the clasp had been broken many years and that she had given up trying to close a thing that would only fall open in her hand. And he stood a moment longer, and then he said half to himself that it was a hard thing to keep something safe in a case that would not close, and she had the strangest sense that he was no longer speaking of the case at all. He did not touch it. He bade her good night, and went away. But she stood a long time at the window after he had gone, with her thumb on the worn pearl, and for the first time in 11 years she let herself cry, quietly, in the dark, not for grief but for the unbearable beginning of hope. And it was at the very height of that fragile hope, of course, that Lady Cassandra Price came to Dunmore. She came on a hard bright morning in February in a fine carriage with a great deal of luggage, a handsome, glossy, black-haired widow of 28 with sharp dark eyes and a thin, satisfied mouth, and a sapphire silk gown that had cost more than the whole of Rosalind's wardrobe in her life. And she came, it transpired, as the guest of a neighboring family who had thrown her constantly in the Marquess's way since he came into the title, and who considered the match as good as made. Lady Cassandra had decided, with the cold thoroughness of a woman who has buried one rich husband and means to acquire another, that the new Marquess of Dunmore was to be hers. She had a good dowry of her own and a good name and a hard, handsome face and a great deal of address, and she had been laying her siege all the autumn, and she had heard, of course, the strange story of the young person the Marquess had won at cards and installed in his house, and she had come to Dunmore to look the young person over and to see her got rid of. She understood at a single glance, with the unerring instinct of one woman sizing up another, two things that the whole stupid county had missed: that the young person was a lady, whatever her circumstances, and that the Marquess looked at her in a way that he had never once looked at Lady Cassandra Price. And from that moment Lady Cassandra set herself, with cold smiling patience, to destroy her. She did it cleverly. She did not rage or sneer. Raging and sneering are for women who have not learned how the world is run. She was, on the surface, all sweetness to Miss Thorne, all gracious, wondering pity, and she let that pity do the work of cruelty, dropping it like cold water in front of company, before the neighboring families who came to dine. She wondered aloud, so kindly, how Miss Thorne must feel, in her singular position, dependent on the charity of a gentleman to whom she was nothing in the world. One like a... Well, she would not say like what. She was sure dear Miss Thorne understood her, and would not wish to make the dear Marquess uncomfortable by presuming on a situation that anyone could see could not last. She admired Rosalind's plain gowns with a tilt of the head that made them rags. She drew the conversation, again and again, with great skill, to the card table, to the dreadful loose modern habit of play, to the sad spectacle of gentlemen who staked what they ought not, until the whole table was looking, with pity or with relish, at the silent young woman who had been one such stake. And Rosalind, who had endured 11 years of Sir Lucius Brand, endured this too, with a straight back and a level chin and a quiet that gave Lady Cassandra nothing to take hold of, and only Mrs. Downe, watching from the side of the room, saw what it cost her, and only the Marquess, watching from the head of the table with his face shut tight, saw it too, and said, to Lady Cassandra's surprise and growing fury, not one single word of agreement, but turned the talk, each time, cold and deliberate, away. The truth began to come to the surface, as buried truths do, by more than one road at once, and all of them ran back to the same place. The first road was Mr. Penhallow. He was an old man now, a careful, precise, gray-haired country solicitor of 63 in a plain good dark coat, and he had been long ago, in another life, the man of business to Mr. Edmund Thorne of Thornfield, Rosalind's true father. He had drawn the marriage settlements when Mr. Thorne married. He had drawn the will when Mr. Thorne lay dying. He had drawn the trust, the careful, loving, ironclad trust by which a dying father, knowing his widow might marry again and her new husband might not be a wise man, had tied up the whole of his considerable fortune for the sole and exclusive benefit of his only child, his daughter Rosalind, to come to her absolutely on her marriage or her 25th birthday, with the income meanwhile to be administered for her by a trustee. And then Mr. Thorne had died, and within the year a new man had married his widow and got himself appointed, by means Mr. Penhallow had never quite understood, sole trustee in the careful old lawyer's place, and from that day Mr. Penhallow had been shut out, told his services were no longer required, told the family's affairs were in other hands, and he had retired, and grown old, and tried not to think about the little girl whose whole future he had so carefully secured and then been forbidden to watch over. But he had never been easy. And that winter, by the small workings of chance, word reached him in his quiet retirement that Mr. Edmund Thorne's daughter, the heiress he had tied up a fortune for, was living as a penniless dependent 11 miles off, having been, it was whispered, actually wagered at a card table by Sir Lucius Brand. and the old man sat very still in his chair for a long time. And then he got out, with shaking hands, the copy he had kept all those years of the True Trust, and he began, quietly, to ask some questions. The second road was Mr. Selby. He was a thin, anxious, shabby, genteel man of 39 in a worn brown coat, and he had been, years before, an under-clerk in the office that handled Sir Lucius Brand's affairs. And he had a thing on his conscience that had been eating him slowly for the better part of a decade. He had been a young man then, and poor and frightened of losing his place, and his master had set him to a piece of work that he had known even as he did it was wrong. He had been made to copy out, over and over until it was perfect. A deed. A deed that purported to be a release and reassignment of the Thorne Trust, transferring the absolute beneficial ownership of the whole fortune from the daughter to her stepfather and guardian, and bearing the signature of the late Mr. Edmund Thorne, who had been 3 years in his grave when the ink was laid. Mr. Selby had copied a dead man's hand. He had practiced it on sheet after sheet, the signature of a man who could not have signed, and he had done it because he was told to and was afraid not to, and when it was perfect he had handed it over and taken his small fee and hated himself. And, being a careful, frightened man, he had not destroyed the spoiled practice sheets as he had been ordered, but had kept one, just one, hidden away. A single sheet covered in the dead man's forged signature, tried over and over, with, in one corner, in his weariness, the thing copied true, the real terms, the daughter's name. He had kept it as a man keeps the one thing that might one day either hang him or save him. And he had carried it. And his shame, for 10 years. The third road was Jonah Crisp, who had served Rosalind's true father before he came to Dunmore, and who remembered, when an old groom is got talking, the strange night long ago when a lawyer's clerk had come secretly to Thornfield after dark, and a paper had been signed by candlelight in the late master's study, with the late master 3 years dead. And Sir Lucius had paid the man and sent him off before dawn and warned the servants to forget they had seen him. Crisp had been a young man and had held the visitor's horse and had thought it queer and had said nothing, because servants who valued their places said nothing. But he had not forgotten. And when he found that the quiet, capable lady who had saved the water meadows was none other than the daughter of his own dead master, the little girl from Thornfield grown up and somehow sunk to a dependent, the old wrong he had half witnessed began to trouble him sorely, and he began, in his slow, honest way, to wonder whom he might tell. But the road that mattered most, in the end, ran through the broken card case, and it was Rosalind herself who walked it. It happened on a still cold night near the end of February, after a particularly cruel evening of Lady Cassandra's sweetness. When Rosalind had come up to her room worn thin and aching, and had taken the little case from the sill to hold it, as she did on the bad nights, for the comfort of her mother's hands that had held it last. She was turning it over and over in her fingers in the candlelight, her thumb moving on the worn pearl, and her mother's words were going round in her tired mind. The old soft riddle. Never to force it open further than it wished to go, that the cards do not lie, only the hands that hold them, and to wait, and to trust that it would give up what it kept when there was at last something it needed to say. And she thought, with a kind of weary tenderness, that there had never been anything in the poor little broken thing at all but a sprig of dead rosemary and a ribbon. That her mother had been wandering at the end, that there was nothing in it to give up. And as she thought it, half not attending, her thumb pressed where it had pressed 10,000 times before, on the thin panel at the back of the card slot, the panel she had always taken for the solid back of the case itself, and this time, perhaps because her hands were older now, or stronger, or because some swollen seam of old wood had at last given way, the panel moved. It moved the smallest fraction, a hair of pearl lifting where it had always seemed whole, and Rosalind went very still, and her heart began to beat slow and hard, and she set the candle close, and she pressed again, carefully the way you press a thing you are afraid to break, and the false panel behind the card slot, which she had carried in her hand and against her heart for 11 years without ever once suspecting it was there, slid aside, and behind it, in a shallow space she had never known existed, lay a folded paper gone soft and yellow with age, and beneath it, a second, heavier than the first. And the breath went out of her entirely, and her mother's voice came back to her across all those years. That a locked thing is not an empty thing, that she must wait, and trust that it would give up what it kept when there was at last something it needed to say. Her hands were shaking so that she could hardly lift them out. The first was a letter. It was in her mother's hand, the dear familiar hand grown thin and faltering toward the end, and it was addressed, on the outside, in faded ink, to my daughter Rosalind, to be read by her alone and in her own need. And Rosalind sat down slowly on the edge of the bed with the letter in her 2 hands and the candle guttering, and she read, for the first time, the voice of her dead mother reaching out to her across 8 years of silence, and this is in part what it said. It said, "My dearest girl, if you are reading this, then it has come to pass as I most feared, and you are in want or in trouble, and the man I married to shelter you has failed you, or worse. Forgive me. I married him in my weakness and my fear, a widow with a child and no head for business, because he was kind to me in my grief and swore to be a father to you, and I believed him. God help me. Until it was too late to unbelieve. I came to learn, too slowly, what manner of man he is, and what he has done, and I had not the strength or the means to undo it before my own health failed. But I have done the one thing I could do, the only thing left to a dying woman with no power in the world, and I have hidden here, in my own mother's little case that he would never think worth the taking, the proof of what is truly yours. For your own dear father, who loved you better than his life, did not leave you penniless, whatever you have been told. He left you everything. He tied up the whole of his fortune in a trust for you alone to be yours absolutely, and the paper folded beneath this one is his own true trust. In his own hand, that names you and only you his heir. The man who calls himself your guardian has forged a false paper to put your fortune into his own pocket, and has spent your inheritance, and has kept you a beggar in your own right, and has let you believe yourself nothing. But you are not nothing, my Rosalind. You were never nothing. You are your father's true and only child, and his whole estate is yours by right, and by law. And here is the proof of it, kept safe for the day you would have need. The cards do not lie, my darling, only the hands that hold them. Do not force your way in the world before your time, wait and watch. And when the moment comes that the truth can do its work, set it on the table and let it be seen. I am sorry I could not give you a braver mother. I gave you the only thing I had left to give. Be happy, my dear girl. Be free. Your loving Mama." Rosalind read it through twice, and then a third time, and then she set it down very carefully on the counterpane. And she unfolded, with hands that had gone quite steady now, the heavier paper beneath, and there it was, exactly as her mother had promised. Beneath her mother's letter lay her true father's own trust in his own hand, naming her his sole heir, the careful, loving, ironclad instrument that Mr. Pennilow had drawn so long ago, every clause of it tying up the whole Thorne fortune for the sole and exclusive benefit of Rosalind Thorne, and folded with it, smaller, a single sheet of a clerk's spoiled practice, the false settlement tried over and over, a dead man's signature copied again and again down the page in a clerk's careful, frightened hand, and in one corner, in weariness, the true terms copied true. The daughter's name, the proof of the forgery laid bare by the very man who had committed it. She sat on the edge of the bed in the small hours with the 3 papers spread before her in the candlelight, the letter and the trust and the forger's spoiled sheet, and she understood, at last, all of it, the whole 11 years of her life turned over in an instant and shown to be a lie. She was not a dependent. She was not a charity ward. She was not nothing. She was the heiress of the entire fortune that her stepfather had been losing, hand by hand, year by year. Across the gaming tables of 3 counties, the very fortune he had been losing the night he ran out of money and wagered her, His own dead wife's daughter, across the green baize, had been hers all along, every penny of it, stolen from her before she was old enough to know she had it. And she had been won, at that table, by a man who had refused to treat her as a stake, and who had brought her home, and whom she had, against all sense, come to love. The cards had not lied, only the hands that held them. Another woman, finding such a thing in such a night, might have run downstairs at once and waked the house and flung the papers in triumph upon the table. Rosalind did not. She sat through the rest of that night with the 3 papers in her lap and her mother's voice in her ears. Do not force your way in the world before your time. Wait and watch. And when the moment comes that the truth can do its work, set it on the table and let it be seen. She understood the warning in it, the hard-won wisdom of a woman who had married in haste and repented at leisure. She knew that she held in her hands the proof of a great crime, but she knew also that she held it alone. A penniless young woman of no standing, in a house where she had no right, against a man who was her legal guardian and a baronet and would lie without blinking, and a forged deed that had stood unquestioned for 10 years and bore, however falsely, the seal of law. If she moved too soon, in the wrong place, before the wrong people, she would be called a liar and a thief and a hysteric, the grasping dependent who had forged a tale to better herself. The papers would be taken from her, or burned or buried in the slow machinery of the courts for years she did not have, and the one chance her mother had bought her with her dying strength would be lost. No, she would do as her mother bade her. She would wait, and she would watch, and she would tell the right person, at the right time, and she would set the truth on the table only when it could not be swept off again. So she folded the letter and the trust and the forger's sheet back into the false panel behind the card slot, and she slid the pearl panel home, and she set the broken case back on the sill in the gray dawn, and she went down to breakfast with her composed and useful face, and she told no one. Not yet. Not even him. It was the hardest secret she had ever kept, and she kept it through the cruelest weeks of her life. For Lady Cassandra Price, sensing that her siege was failing, that the Marquess's cold courtesy to herself was not warming, and his cold courtesy to the dependent was, abandoned sweetness for the surer weapon of a public blow. The occasion was a dinner at Dunmore in early March. A large one. The neighboring families gathered. Candles and silver and the long table that Rosalind herself had made fit to dine at again. And Lady Cassandra over the second course, in her clear carrying drawing-room voice, with every appearance of generous concern, raised the matter of Miss Thorne's future. It was not right, she said, that dear Miss Thorne should go on in so very irregular a situation, the talk of the county, a young unmarried woman living unprotected in a single gentleman's house on no footing that anyone could name. It did the dear Marquess no credit, and Miss Thorne herself less. She had taken the liberty, she said, out of pure kindness, of speaking to a connection of hers, a most respectable person, who was in need of a genteel companion housekeeper of exactly Miss Thorne's stamp, a person used to dependence and grateful for a place, and she was happy to say the situation might be had, and Miss Thorne removed from her awkwardness, within the fortnight. She turned to Rosalind down the length of the table, smiling, and said that she was sure dear Miss Thorne would be sensible of the great kindness, and would not wish, out of any false pride, to remain where she could only be an embarrassment to a gentleman who had been so very charitable to her already. The table went quiet. Every eye turned, with that particular avid pity that is the cruelest thing in the world, to the silent young woman in the plain gray gown. It was the old humiliation, the Marsh Hollow humiliation, dressed in lace and served on silver. The public reduction of Rosalind Thorne to a thing that might be passed from hand to hand and disposed of for her own good. And the dreadful joke of it, the thing that rose in her throat half as a sob and half as wild laughter, was that she sat there at that table the secret mistress of a fortune that could have bought Lady Cassandra Price 10 times over, and could not say so, must not say so, not here. Not yet. She thought of her mother. Wait. And watch. She set down her fork, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she lifted her chin, and she said in a quiet, even voice that carried down the whole length of the table, that she thanked Lady Cassandra for her concern, but that she was not at present seeking a situation, and that where she should go and what she should do were, she ventured to think, matters for herself to decide. It was nothing. It was the mildest possible refusal, but it was said with such perfect composure, such complete unbegging dignity, by a woman everyone had expected to crumble, that it landed in the silent room like a stone in still water, and Lady Cassandra's smile went stiff, because she had been answered, and bettered by a dependent, in front of everyone. And then the Marquess spoke. He had sat through Lady Cassandra's speech with his face shut and his eyes very dark, and now he set down his glass with a small precise click into the silence, and he said, coldly, distinctly to the whole table and to no one, that he must beg leave to correct Lady Cassandra upon a point of fact. Miss Thorne, he said, was not in any irregular situation, and was not living on anyone's charity, and was certainly not an embarrassment to him. Miss Thorne was a gentlewoman who had been most grievously wronged by persons who should have protected her, and who was a guest under his roof and under his protection until those wrongs should be set right, and he would consider it a personal affront, he said, looking down the table with a face like winter, if any person present, in his house or out of it, should presume again to speak of her as anything less than what she was. And he let that sit, the unmistakable cold ducal fury of it, until even Lady Cassandra dropped her eyes, and then he turned, deliberately, and asked Mrs. Downe to bring up a particular wine he was fond of, and so closed the subject, and the dinner went on. And Rosalind sat with her hands folded and her heart going like a hammer, because no one in the whole of her life had ever stood up in a room full of people and defended her, and the man who had just done it did not even know what she truly was. He had defended not the heiress but the dependent, not for what she had but for what she was, and that, she thought, was the difference between him and every other soul she had known. He found her afterward, late, when the guests had gone, in the cold morning room where she had gone to be alone and to stop her hands from shaking. He had a branch of candles in his hand, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and for a moment the cold guarded mask was quite gone from his face, and there was only a tired man looking at a woman he was afraid he had presumed upon. He said he hoped he had not made things worse for her, by speaking, that he knew his protection was a double-edged gift, that it fed the very gossip it meant to silence, that he had not been able to sit there and let it be done. And Rosalind, standing in the candlelight with her composure in ruins, looked at him and very nearly told him everything, the case and the letter and the trust and the whole monstrous truth, because she wanted, with a sudden fierce ache, to be known by him, truly known, to lay it all in his hands. But she heard her mother's voice, wait and watch, the right person at the right time, and she understood that the right time was not quite yet, that there were proofs still to gather and a trap still to be sure of, and that she would not gamble her one chance even on him until she could set the whole truth on the table at once where it could not be swept away. So she did not tell him, but she crossed the room to him, which she had never done, and she took the candlestick gently out of his hand and set it down, and she said low, that no one had ever once defended her before, in the whole of her life, and that she would not forget it, whatever came, and she took his hand in both of hers, as he had taken hers in the flooded yard, and she held it, and for a long moment neither of them moved or spoke, and the whole unspoken weight of everything between them stood in the air, and then she let him go, and bade him good night, and went up to her room, and took the broken case from the sill, and held it against her, and wept and resolved that she would make the truth safe, and soon. She began, the very next day, with great care, to gather her allies. She wrote first in secret to Mr. Penhallow, her father's old solicitor, whose name she had found upon the true trust in her father's hand, not knowing that the old man was already, by his own road, asking questions about her. And when his answer came, joyful and trembling and full of a decade's stored remorse and resolve. She wept again, for she understood that she was not, after all, entirely alone, that there was one man living who had known her father and drawn the true trust and would swear to it. Through Mr. Penhallow, in the slow, careful weeks that followed, came the others. He knew, in the way old country lawyers know everything, of the existence of a frightened under-clerk named Selby who had left Brand's service under a cloud, and a quiet inquiry, and the offer of a clear conscience and the protection of a marquess, brought Mr. Selby and his hidden spoiled sheet at last out of 10 years of hiding. And Rosalind, sounding out the Dunmore household with the instinct she had honed over a lifetime of reading rooms, found in Jonah Crisp the groom not a stranger but a man who had served her own father, who remembered Thornfield, who had held the forger's horse on that long-ago night and never forgotten, and in Hobbs, the Marquess's weathered devoted valet and man of business, a shrewd loyal ally who had disliked and distrusted Lady Cassandra Price from the first, and who took, quietly and entirely, the side of the young woman who had brought his master's dead house back to life. One by one, in secret through the lengthening days of that spring, the pieces came together: the true trust, the dead mother's letter, the forger's spoiled practice sheet, the old solicitor who had drawn the original, the clerk who had copied the lie, the groom who had witnessed the signing of it, until Rosalind held in her hands not a single fragile sheet that might be called a forgery itself, but a whole woven chain of proof and living witness that no court and no liar could break. And still she waited, as her mother had taught her, for the right place, and the right moment, to set it on the table. That moment, she decided, would be the Spring Assembly. The Spring Assembly was the great event of the county's year, held at the assembly rooms in the market town when the roads dried and the families came in from their estates. A glittering, crowded affair of cards and dancing and supper under 100 candles, where everyone of any consequence in 3 parishes would be gathered in one bright room. It was, Rosalind understood, the perfect table on which to lay the truth, for 2 reasons. The first was that Sir Lucius Brand would certainly be there, drawn as he was always drawn to anywhere there was deep play, and she meant the reckoning to be made to his face and not behind his back. The second was harder, and she had thought about it a long time. She meant it to be done in the most public place in the county, before every person who had ever pitied her or looked through her or passed her by, not for the pleasure of shaming them, but because a truth that is buried can be dug up again, and a truth that is whispered can be denied, but a truth that is set on a table before 100 witnesses, with the proofs in hand and the living witnesses standing by, can never afterward be unsaid. Her mother had told her to wait until the truth could do its work. This was where it would do its work. She would set it on the table once, in the full blaze of the light, and let it be seen. She did not tell the Marquess what she meant to do, only that she begged him to take her to the assembly, and to trust her, and to be near her when the time came. He looked at her a long moment, and whatever he saw in her steady face seemed to decide him, and he said only that he would be at her side the whole evening, and that she had but to lift her hand and he would do whatever she asked, no questions. And she understood that he had given her, a dependent with no claim on him in the world, his complete and unconditional trust, and she carried the warmth of it with her into that bright room like a coal in her hand. She wore the one good gown she had let Mrs. Downe make for her, a pale silver gray that became her, and her mother's garnet ring on her finger at last instead of on its ribbon, and in her reticule wrapped in flannel. The little broken mother of pearl card case with everything it had kept all those years. The assembly rooms were full and bright and loud when they came in, and Rosalind felt the ripple of the room as they entered, the Marquess of Dunmore and the young woman he had won at cards, the scandal of the season, and she walked through it with her chin level and her hand on his arm and let them look. She saw Lady Cassandra Price across the room in steel gray silk, her face going sharp and watchful at the sight of them together. She saw, at the card tables already, his back to the room, his shoulders loose with wine and false confidence, Sir Lucius Brand. and she saw, ranged quietly along the wall near the door where she had arranged for them to be, the four she had brought. Old Mr. Penhallow in his good dark coat with his leather case of papers, anxious Mr. Selby in his brushed brown best, white-faced but resolved steady Jonah Crisp turning his hat in his hands, and the Marquess's man Hobbs, watchful, ready, everything was in its place. She had only to choose her moment. It came, as such moments do, of its own accord, and it came from Sir Lucius himself. He had been losing again. She saw it in the set of his shoulders, in the rising pitch of his laugh, and at length, his ready money gone, he turned in his chair, casting about the room for someone to lend or someone to charm, and his eye fell upon his stepdaughter, standing across the bright room on the arm of the Marquess of Dunmore, in a gown finer than he had ever given her, and Rosalind watched the calculation move across his florid face, the slow, drunken understanding that the dependent he had thrown away had landed somewhere soft, and might yet be worth something to him. He rose, and he came across the room toward her, with his arms half spread and his charming, dreadful smile, calling her his dear girl, his dear Rosalind, loud enough for the nearest tables to turn, saying how well she looked, how glad he was to see her so comfortably bestowed, that he had always known the dear Marquess would do the handsome thing by her, and that he hoped, now that they were all such friends, that his lordship would not take it amiss if a man spoke a word to him about a trifling temporary embarrassment. He meant to use her, in front of everyone, to beg. It was the Marsh Hollow night all over again, and Rosalind looked at him, this man who had stolen her whole life, and gambled it away, and then gambled her, and she felt no anger, only a great, cold clarity, and she knew that the moment her mother had told her to wait for had come at last. She let go of the Marquess's arm. She stepped forward, into the space between her stepfather and the watching room, and she said, in a clear, quiet voice that somehow carried over the noise so that the nearer tables fell silent, and then the further ones, that before Sir Lucius spoke to the Marquess of any embarrassment of his, she had a matter of business to lay before the company, and that she thought it concerned them all, and most particularly concerned the law. And then she did not raise her voice, or shake a paper at the room, or weep, or accuse. She only opened her reticule, and took out the little flannel bundle, and unwrapped it, and set the small, broken mother-of-pearl card case down on the green baize of the nearest card table, in the blaze of the assembly candles, where everyone could see it, and she let the truth her mother had hidden behind the broken clasp be read out at last into the bright, crowded room. She told it plainly, in order, the way she had kept the books all those years. She told them who she was, the only child of Mr. Edmund Thorne of Thornfield, and his sole heir. She told them what her father had done, that he had left the whole of his fortune in trust for her alone, to be hers absolutely. And she opened the false panel of the case, there before them all, and drew out the papers, and gave them, one by one, into the hands of Mr. Penhallow, who had come forward to stand beside her, and the old solicitor, in his dry, precise courtroom voice that trembled only a little, identified each one to the silent room. This, he said, holding it up, was the true trust, in the hand of the late Mr. Thorne, which he himself had drawn 25 years before, and could swear to before any court in England. Here was the late Mr. Thorne's true signature, and here, he said, was the signature on the deed by which Sir Lucius Brand had claimed the fortune as his own, a deed dated 3 years after Mr. Thorne lay in his grave, bearing the signature of a man 3 years dead. And here, he said, and his voice rose, here was how it had been done, and he drew out Mr. Selby's spoiled practice sheet, the dead man's name forged over and over down the page, and he called Mr. Selby forward, who came white and shaking but steady, and who told the room, in a voice cracking with 10 years of shame and relief, that he had copied that signature himself, under Sir Lucius Brand's own hand and orders, and would swear to it on his soul. And Jonah Crisp came forward and told of the clerk who had come by night to a dead man's study, and the chain was complete, and it was unbreakable, and it had been laid out link by link in the most public room in the county before 100 witnesses, and it could never, now, be unsaid. There was a silence in the bright room such as Rosalind had never heard, and then it broke, not into uproar but into a low, terrible murmur, the sound of a whole society turning at once, like a tide, away from one man and toward one woman. Every eye went to Sir Lucius Brand. He had gone the color of tallow. He tried, of course. He was Sir Lucius, and he tried to the last. He laughed, and it cracked. He said it was a wicked fabrication, a grasping girl's invention, that he would have the law on all of them. But the law was already there, in the persons of 2 magistrates among the company who had come quietly to stand at Mr. Penhallow's shoulder, and the papers were in their hands, and the witnesses stood plain before them. And the laugh died in his throat as he looked round the room, and saw not one single face that believed him. Not one, and understood that the charm that had carried him through 50 years of ruin had failed him at last. All at once, completely, in front of everyone. He did not bluster long. He seemed, all at once, to shrink, to become an old florid frightened man with nothing left, and the magistrates took him quietly by either arm, and led him out of the bright room through the parting silent crowd, and that was the end of Sir Lucius Brand in that county and in Rosalind's life, not murdered, not struck down, only exposed, and ruined, and led away to answer to the law for what he had stolen, which was a heavier and a truer justice than any blow. Rosalind did not watch him go with any triumph. She found, when it was done, that she felt no joy in his fall at all, only a vast and trembling weariness, and a strange grief for her mother, who had not lived to see it, and who had bought this moment with the last of her strength. She had not raised her voice once. She had not gloated. She had only set the truth on the table and let it be seen, exactly as her mother had told her, and let it do its own work, and its work was done. As for Lady Cassandra Price, she was seen, in the confusion, to gather her steel-gray skirts and her connections and slip from the room without taking her leave, having grasped, with the swift cold sense that had always served her, that the dependent she had tried to have removed to a companion's place within the fortnight was now revealed to be one of the great heiresses of the county and the acknowledged choice of the Marquess of Dunmore, and that there was nothing left for Lady Cassandra to do at Dunmore or anywhere near it, and she was not, by anyone, much missed, and her cruelty was repaid not with cruelty, but with the far colder coin of being, from that night, of no consequence whatever. It was in the quiet after, when the room had begun to remember itself and the magistrates were gone and the company stood about not quite knowing how to take up the evening again, that the Marquess of Dunmore came to her. He had stood back through the whole of it, as she had asked, near at hand and silent, his face working through astonishment and understanding and something else, and now he came and stood before her. And he was very pale, and Rosalind saw, with a catch of her heart, that he was afraid. For he had understood, of course, what it meant. All of it. And not only the part that vindicated her. He understood that the penniless dependent he had won at a card table and brought home and come, against all his guarded careful nature, to love, was no penniless dependent at all, but a great heiress in her own right, mistress now of her own fortune, free, with no debt and no obligation and no need of any man in the world. And he understood that this changed everything, and that he, a proud man who had been a poor relation and had learned to want nothing he had not earned, could not now, in honor, say one word of what was in his heart, because to a woman who had just come into a fortune, the offer of a man who held her, however falsely in his power, would look like one more attempt to take what was hers. So he did not offer. He did the harder, the better thing. He told her, low and plain, his pride all laid down, that he rejoiced in her vindication with his whole heart, that everything she had by right was hers, and that he would put it into her own hands and her own control on the morrow, every penny, with Mr. Penhallow to see it done, that the fiction by which she had been won at a card table was exactly that, a fiction, and had never bound her, and he released her from it utterly and had never held it. that she was free, entirely free, to go where she would and be what she would, with all his help and no claim upon her whatsoever, and that the carriage would take her wherever in the world she wished to go, that very night if she chose. And then he stopped, and his jaw worked, and he said, the only thing he allowed himself, that he would carry the memory of her courage in that room to the end of his life, and he bowed, and made to step back, to give her the room and the freedom he believed he owed her. This man who had once been a stake himself and so would die before he made a stake or a prize of anyone he loved. And Rosalind Thorne, heiress, free at last, free for the first time in her whole life, looked at the proud, guarded, honorable man stepping back from her out of the sheer nobility of his refusal to grasp. And she made her choice, the first wholly free choice of her life, made not because she was bound or bought, or wagered or had nowhere else to go, but because she wished it, with her whole heart. She did not let him step back. She reached out and she took his hand in both of hers, as she had twice before, and she held it fast, and she said, steadily, that she had been disposed of by other people her whole life, set on tables and handed across them, and that she would be disposed of no longer by anyone, not even by his honor, that the choosing, this time, would be hers. And she said that she had had, in 11 years, exactly one person stand up in a room full of strangers and defend her for nothing, for no gain, when she was nobody and had nothing, and that she had loved him before she knew she was an heiress, and would love him if she lost it all again tomorrow, and that if he would have her, not the fortune, not the heiress, but her, then she chose him, freely, of her own will, with her own hand, the way her mother had told her a thing of worth must always at last be chosen. And the cold Marquess of Dunmore, who had not wept since he was a robbed and laughing at boy in a grey morning long ago, put his hand over both of hers upon the green baize where she had set the truth, and bowed his head, and was for a moment unable to speak at all. They were married in the early summer, quietly at the little church near Dunmore, with Mrs. Downe weeping frankly in the front pew, and Hobbs standing up beside his master and old Mr. Penhallow giving the bride away, having said it was the proudest office of his long life. The Thorne fortune came back into Rosalind's own hands, every recoverable penny of it, and she settled the half that was not needed for the estate upon trusts of her own devising, for unprovided gentlewomen and for the tenant families of the water meadows, because she knew, better than most, what it was to be dependent on the charity of careless men. Sir Lucius Brand answered to the law, and ended his days a broken man in reduced and supervised circumstances, which was Justice Mr. Selby, his conscience clear at last, was found a respectable place by the Marquess, and lived quietly and well. Jonah Crisp was made steward of Dunmore in full, the post that had stood empty, and served it faithfully for 30 years. And the great walled garden behind the house, the wilderness Rosalind had begun to clear with her own soft hands in the worst of that first winter, came back, season by season, to such beauty as the oldest servants could not remember, and along its restored border grew rosemary, a great deal of rosemary, grown from the one half-strangled bush she had freed, the same rosemary whose dried sprig had lain all those years in her mother's broken case against the day she would have need. That broken case was broken no longer, for among the Marquess's first acts as her husband, done quietly, without a word, was to take the little mother-of-pearl card case to a silversmith, and have a new clasp made for it by his own particular order, a small fine silver clasp, so that the case her mother had told her never to force, the case that had kept its secret faithfully through all the long years until there was at last something it needed to say, would close now, and open, gently and surely, exactly as it was meant to. And on the writing desk by the window in the room that was now hers stood the little pearl case, its clasp mended at last by his own order so that it would close and open as it was meant to. The cold wager scrap on which her name had been written and slid across the baize long since burned to ash on the hearth, the silver vine on the lid worn bright once more under her thumb, and on the quiet evenings the lord of the house would come and set his hand over hers upon the lid, and listen in the firelight to all that her mother had kept safe behind the broken catch through every one of those long years. The proof and the letter long since done their work, and nothing left inside it now but a sprig of rosemary, and a faded ribbon, and the whole of a free woman's hard-won peace. For this, in the end, was the truth that the little case had carried all along, folded beneath the proof and the law and the fortune, and it is the truth I leave with you tonight. A person is never truly a thing to be won or lost or set on a table among the coin, however the careless hands of the world may try to deal them, and what is locked away in silence, kept faithful against a long darkness, will give up its worth in the end to the one who waits, and watches, and does not force it before its time. So I will ask you, before the candle gutters when your own hard winter comes, will you be the one who scatters what was entrusted to you across the green baize for the pleasure of a single reckless night, or the one who keeps it safe against all loss until the morning it is needed? And so the candle burns low on another tale. Stay a while in the quiet, and tell me in the comments whether she chose rightly.